YouTube, hi, my name is Mark, and this is Nixon Motorsports. This channel is all about motorsports, from racing to exotic cars and occasionally simulators. Today's video, we're going to prep a ZX10R motor for installation in the race car. So come along, let me show you what's going on. So let me talk about what we're doing today and why we're doing this. So for many of you who've been watching this channel for a while, you know that I raced a Formula 1000 race car, and been doing that now for a few years. But this particular race car is a 1000cc motorcycle engine requirement, right? It's part of the spec of the race car itself. And so to put a motorcycle engine in any race car, whether it be a Formula 1000 or many others out there, it requires a few modifications, a few things that you have to do to the engine before you can actually install it in the race car. So this video today will be doing that. I'll be showing you the steps involved, what I do in prepping a brand new engine for the race car, okay? So let's get to it. So let me show you a couple items here before we get into it. First, I'll pan down here. Here's the motor. This is a stock ZX10R motor to a degree, right? It's been at the engine builder. It's been gone through. It's got custom cams in it. It's been degreed, all the timing aspects. It's been on the dyno, so it's been broken in. This motor, though, at the moment is in a standard configuration that you would actually use for a bike. So for an example, if I roll down here, you can see the big deep pan itself, the oil pan. So this is a wet sump system. So that's the motor itself. If I scroll over here, let me show you some of the parts that I use and need to prep the engine itself. If I start with here, first, this is the dry sump oil pan that will go on the motor. This is the scavenge pump itself, and this actually is driven off the shaft where the water pump would be for the OEM motor. So the original mechanical water pump actually comes off, and this will go in place. I need a couple new housing parts. So this is a one portion of the water pump housing. It's just a brand new one, and I do that when I install these pumps because I have to do some modifications in it, and I'll show you how we do that. This tube, this is just the oil pickup tube that goes here in the back of my pan and my oil tank itself. This is a bypass plate, an adapter. This removes the oil filter off the engine, and in place this goes. This replaces that bracket itself, and I use an external oil filter. So that's what this is. It's a high pressure line output. This is just a few fittings again for this setup. This is a small adapter that actually goes on the clutch cover. Normally you have the small, in fact I'll roll down here, you have this small little filler piece for the wet sump system. So this actually goes in place of that, and this is a breather line for the oil system itself. Small little custom shifter bracket. I actually take the breathers off the cylinder head. I put these Brock's plates in place. Anyway, so that's a few items. If I roll over here, here are the scavenge pump lines. So this is a two-stage scavenge pump, and this is in front of the pan itself. And this is the pneumatic shift actuator that I'll put on the engine. So there's a handful of things. So let me go ahead and get the motor. Let me inspect the motor here, turn it around, and I'll continue with the video, okay? Okay, so that's a few of the parts that go on this engine. I'll bring you along each step of the way so you can see what needs to be done, okay? I stood the motor up just looking at this a little closer. So several things for the race car installation with the bike motor that we'll be doing. You know, this cover will come off. That does not go on the engine itself. The hose, the water lines themselves, the water pump, all of that will be coming off. And I'll have to do a couple modifications. The water temp sensor here itself, this fitting and this line, I do replace that. I put a DTM connector on the ignition trigger pickup for my Motec system, so I'll be doing that. I'll do a modification to the thermostat housing here, and I'll pull it off. I'll show you this. It's no big deal, but what I do, and it's just my preference, I actually take the thermostat out of the engine here, and I have this open, and I have an external thermostat that is easy to get access to, so that's why I do that. First thing is, though, I have the motor up here before we get the pan off and such. This is the oil filler inlet that I was telling you about. You know, this small little fitting. This little guy. So that needs to be replaced, and I replaced that with this adapter, and pretty simple. This gives me an AN10 fitting that I use for my oil tank itself, just a breather piece. Okay. You know, it's funny as I look at this. This is a brand new motor, by the way. It hasn't been in the car before. Every time I do this, you know, it makes me smile. It's all these teeny little things you have to do to get the engine prepped and ready. You know, like as an example, I use a hydraulic cylinder for my clutch, and I have to take this bracket off, grind this pin out of there because it's not a removable one. Little things like that, I'll show you when I do it. It's no big deal. So if you saw the video last year, the Motec conversion project that I did for the race car, one of the items was adding NOx sensors to the engine with the entire Motec change. And because of that, I have to add and put the NOx sensors on this engine. So let me show you, first of all, what the NOx sensors look like. These are a Bosch unit, and if I can get close here, you can see it. 2-pin, very simple. You can argue there's many different places of where you should mount the NOx sensor, and on solid engine block and such is appropriate. I mean, these are basically a microphone, right? They're just listening for certain audio frequencies. And anyway, I ended up mounting my NOx sensors here on the head itself, and it's not ideal. I get that. You know, the head does have a gasket on it, so it can take some vibrations away, but I find it working quite well. In fact, what I've done, if I go over here on this side, so what I've done is I mount 2 NOx sensors on the head itself, like I'm showing you, the valve cover, excuse me. And this is what I use, and seems to work well. So anyway, that's it. Let me tighten these up and we'll continue, okay? So as I continue to work on the motor, so I've taken the water hose off here. I will not be using that. This water pump itself, I'm going to pull that off here in a few minutes. Again, this is a mechanical pump driven by the engine. I have to put in fact, let me show you here. The oil scavenge pump actually will go in place of the water pump itself, right? So anyway, that's going to come off. I'll pull this counter sprocket off. I will not use this. I use a 530 chain for the race car, and anyway, pull that off and replace that. I also will be pulling off the gear sensor, the stock gear sensor, and replacing that with another one. It's basically the same thing. These are dual channel sensors for gear position. I just converted over to a DTM style connector for my Motec system. That's it. Okay. So let's get this counter sprocket on. Again, like I told you, I use 530 chain for the race car, and I always put a new washer on. You could reuse them, of course, but just out of habit, I always put a new one on. The nuts, I'll use them maybe twice, two times before I replace those. I'll tighten this up in the car once I get the chain on, that type of thing. But anyway, that's the counter sprocket. Okay, so I got the motor upside down here. Let me pan down and show you what it looks like from this angle. Oil pan itself, right? This is the stock OEM pan. Again, I'm going to pull this off. I'm going to replace it with this BRD oil pan itself. So let's go ahead and pull this thing off and see what this looks like. I already took the bolts out. There we go. So if you haven't seen a ZX10R bottom of an oil pan, this is what it looks like. Okay, and we will not be using anything here. I stand corrected. We use one thing. And let me go down here, set this down so I can show you. See this little guy here? That is a pressure relief valve itself. So I pull that out. I just use the stock pressure relief valve, and that's what controls the pressure in the engine. So that I need to pull out, and I install that here in this threaded fitting here on the BRD pan. So I need to do that before I can put the pan on the engine itself. And outside of that, it's pretty straightforward. This is the pickup for the stock pan, right? We'll not be using that. And this, I believe it's just a vent piece itself here. This actually will be just pulled out and set aside as well. So let me go ahead and do that, and I'll bring you back. So I have the pan off, as you can tell. I cleaned up the gasket area just a touch. I recommend, and I always put a new gasket on. You could obviously reuse it, but there's nothing worse than going through all the trouble getting your motor in the car and then to have an oil leak. So I always recommend a new gasket. If I pan over here to the pan itself, now here you can see I have the pressure relief valve actually installed, and the pan, it's about ready to put on. I have these two little retainer bolts here that I have to pull off before I actually can get it mounted. Those are just temporary. The last thing actually that comes to mind that you need to do to get the BRD pan on this ZX10R motor, this gasket, this O-ring piece here, you do need to remove, as this gasket actually is mated for that piece itself, so you don't need that other piece. And if I can spin this around, this is as easy as it is to install. Put the new gasket on, of course, and this will slide in place just like that. And that's what it will look like. So let me go ahead, get the gasket material on, get this thing mounted, and I'll bring you right back. So before I put the pan on, I want to show you one little thing. If you've noticed, there's this shaft in here with nothing on it. That's actually where the counterbalancer for the stock motor actually is. And if you've seen these engines before from the internals, there is no counterbalancer. So the motor builder actually pulled that out It's not really a horsepower thing. It allows the engine to rev quicker, and it's just a little bit of mass, a rotating mass piece that is removed. So anyway, let's get this pan on, see what it looks like. So I have the oil pan on the motor, and let me pan down and show you what this looks like. A little different than the big, deep, wet sump, right? It's very low profile. Looks good. Again, this is a BRD dry sump oil system, by the way. If you need connection to them, let me know. We don't have any sponsorship or anything like that, commercial stuff with them. We're simply a customer. We've been using BRD products for quite a while. Highly recommend them. Actually, very good. So here's the scavenge inlet. You know. Where the pump's actually sucking out of the pan, so it creates a vacuum there. And this is one of the high pressure hose lines to the external cooler and filter. This is the inlet for the oil supply into the pump itself, and that's about it. So I'm going to go ahead and get this stock oil cooler off of the engine here, and go ahead and get my adapter put on. I'll show you what that looks like. So now we need to put this adapter in place where the original oil cooler was for the engine, and that's here. You can see I have it removed, and this adapter, pretty simple. There's a couple O-rings here that I don't have on at the moment, but just to show you how this mounts in here, it simply bolts in place like so. And you have a couple options here. I plugged this one port, the other port, and these are standard threads, but I actually put a fitting here. This is what I use for my oil pressure sensor, okay? And this is a high pressure out for the engine itself, and goes to the external oil cooler and oil filter itself. So let me go ahead and get this on and show you what it looks like. Okay, so I have the adapter in place. I have it mounted. I do use red Loctite on these 4 mounting bolts. I do that just as a safety item. Typically when you get this plate on, you're not going to be removing it for the life of the motor. So I make sure this thing's mounted nice and solid. Again, you know, there's high pressure oil on the back side of this. So so there's that. I have the 2 scavenge lines in place here, and these are pretty good sized lines, a large orifice. They'll go directly to the oil pump. So the bottom end here is pretty much done. I'm going to go ahead and flip. I'm going to go ahead and flip the motor over and get the water pump out and start getting prepped to get the scavenge, the oil pump in. Okay. So when you take these 3 bolts off here of the water pump, the top housing of the water pump comes right off, right? So here's the impeller for the water pump itself, and the rest of the housing. So what we need to do at this point is to pull the rest of this housing out, and this is what will mate the oil pump will actually replace this. So we have to do a modification to this base housing. I'll show you what that entails here in a minute. And it's usually a good time when I'm here at this point, or when I get the housing out here, I'll go ahead and swap out the sensor, because it's really easy to get to it at that point. Okay, so let me get this off and show you what it looks like. Okay, so as I lift the pump housing off, this is what it looks like if you have not seen that. That's actually part of the oil pump itself. Let me set it down, I'll come right back to it, and scroll down here. So this is actually the oil pump for the engine itself. There is a shaft down down at the bottom, it actually has a slot in it. So a shaft actually, in fact, let me show you. This is a shaft actually from the water pump housing itself. It actually goes through here, and it has a pin that actually aligns with it, and so it's a solid mount with the shaft, if I can say it. So that's actually how that goes in. Okay, so just wanted to show you that. So as I pan over here, I have a brand new housing, and why do I do that? Well, I can take this housing obviously and pull it apart and do the same thing. I just find it easier with a new housing. What I need to do is open up. If I move this over here, as an example where it goes, I open up a nice hole here, so I have access to the bolts for the gear sensor itself. It's the only reason I do that. And when I put the pump in here, if I can do this with one hand, so you can see as I try to hold the camera and show the pump, it actually will assemble like this with the housing. Now, I didn't push it all the way through, but ultimately this pin here from the pump takes the second part of the pump here and actually mounts inside the engine just like that. So the oil pump itself works exactly as it should, and that's what's involved actually getting this pump in place. So before I do that, there's one little important thing you need to do with your housing. And now, if you're using a water pump, it's different. We're not. And so there's this small little hole down here in the bottom of this stock housing itself. You need to tap it and plug that hole, otherwise you'll have a small oil leak that you don't want to have, right? So I actually use a little 1032 little socket head, if you can see that, and I'll just tap that and plug that. Okay, so I do that. I drill my hole here to have access to the gear sensor while the pump's still mounted in the engine. And last thing I have to do is put a new oil seal in place here, and then you have one O-ring that you'll put on the back side of this before you're ready to mount it. It's pretty straightforward. So let me go ahead and get this plug in place, cut this up a bit, so I have a hole like I talked about, and I'll bring you back. Okay, so I have the housing. This is the modified housing all ready to go. I have my O-ring here installed. I have that small little plug inserted. I put a new seal in place here, and this is the opening I talked about. You don't need a big hole, but this allows you to get a wrench to get to the gear sensor. That's all that is. And this pump, this doesn't matter actually. It just uses these two mounts here. There's no water or fluids at all through here. Okay, so the way you install it is this will slide over the shaft, and here, let me do that real quick. Okay, so I just slid the pump in, and you can hear it once it seats. You can hear it. It just slides right in, piece of cake. And again, before I mount it, just to show you again, this is how it will actually go into the engine this way. And see the notch on that bottom side of the pin there from the shaft? that notch has to align with that notch straight in there, if you can see that. So you have to kind of move it around a little bit and align it, and just let it slide in gently. So from here, you need to slide in, if you can see this here, this small little dowel goes through the shaft, right? Then as you slide, there we go. Then as you slide the impeller here from the gear, or excuse me, from the oil pump in, it actually will, in fact, let me pull this out so you can see it again. You can see the indented side on that one end, the other end it's flat. So you want to make sure you get that on the right end, and it'll just slide in all the way. At this point, it's ready to mount, and let's get it in the engine and see what it looks like. Okay, I have the BRD dry sump installed actually on the motor. I have a few things yet to do that I'll show you here in a minute, but let me just pan down. I want to show you what this looks like. So here is the scavenge pump itself is installed. And here are the two lines that pick up oil from the pan itself, right? And then ultimately here is the out that goes back to the swirl tank itself for the oil. So this is what it looks like. I have the modified J-arm installed here. This is what I use for the shift actuator that mounts in here as well. I'm not going to mount that now until I get this engine in the car, just because I have to be able to get to the counter sprocket, that type of thing. But this is what the BRD dry sump looks like on the ZX10R. At least this portion of it from the bottom of the engine view. Okay, so let me spin the motor around and continue. So now I have the engine stood up. Dry sumps on it, so I just showed you, and I've got a couple things yet I need to do though, so let me just pan down here. It's pretty close, but I mentioned it earlier. So this is the ignition sensor, the trigger wheel itself for the ECU. I do not use, there was an OEM oil pressure switch on the bottom here. That's what this was for. I'll pull that off. I don't use that. And then ultimately I just put a DTM connector on this for the Motec system. So I got to do that. I'm going to pull the thermostat housing off. I'm going to plug this drain plug and take the thermostat out. As I mentioned earlier, if you heard me, I use an external thermostat, so I have easy access if I want to change the thermostat value itself. And then I need to pull this pin out here so I can attach my clevis for the hydraulic cylinder for clutch control. That's about it. And get those done, do a quick walk around, and then this motor will be ready to install. So I finally have this engine prepped and ready. Let me pan down and show you this engine one more time. And so I've added the DTM connector for the ignition trigger. I went ahead and took the thermostat out like I talked about, and have this clutch lever modified. I have to put a clevis on here for my hydraulic cylinder that I use to control the motor, or control the clutch, sorry. So that's about it. As I walk around and look at this thing, I showed you how to do the install for the BRD dry sump, at least the pan, the pump, and so on. The tank, actually I'll pan over here. Here's my spar in the rear of the car. This is the oil tank itself for the dry sump. This mates to the back of the engine, and there's a tube down here in the bottom that mates right up to the back of that oil pan. But that's what it looks like, and that's what's involved to get the engine ready for an install. And you only do this on the first time because you know, there's just some changes you have to make, of course, right, before you can adapt it to your race car. But anyway, this is the engine, and what's kind of cool about it, so this is a 2021 actually ZX10R motor, and it's not the RR, but according to the engine builder, there's a few little changes that he noticed in the oil galleys and things, you know, in the internals, which is kind of cool. It produced the same horsepower that we saw on our 19RR motor, on dyno at least, so that's a very good sign. The motor is basically stock. We do small things like increasing the compression in the head with piston clearance, piston valve clearance, if I can talk. So we do increase the compression ratio a little bit. We put race cams in it. We put the heavier valve springs that Kawasaki recommends in the valve train, and increase the springs for the clutch to make sure that you don't have any slip issues. In a race car, we have a lot more tire than bikes do, so doing that with your clutch is a real good idea. But outside of that, you know, it's ready to go. So this motor will be installed in the race car next, and I'll have another video on that, okay? Okay, so I'd like to talk to you for a minute about, I'll just refer to this as a tip. Again, it's my opinion, you know, use it or not, it's simply something I just want to share with you. And that is the chain tensioner for a motorcycle engine. So let me go down here and show you what I'm talking about. So here's my ZX10R motor I'm getting ready to put in the race car. This right here is the stock or the OEM chain tensioner. So you have a chain here that goes up and drives your camshafts on top of your engine. These tensioners have a job of keeping that chain tension, right? Now, a lot of motorcycle racers believe in and use manual tensioners there. They replace the stock or the OEM tensioner, and they put these manual tensioners in place. I too used to do that, and the belief is that it's if you do not do that, that it's a failure point. What I found is it actually, at least in race car use, it actually creates a stress or failure point for the engine. Let me try to explain. At least this is my opinion again. So I used to run the manual tensioners for quite some time, and as you know, many of you do this. The manual tensioners, it's not really scientific as far as how much tension you put on the chain, how little. It's kind of by sound, and anyway, everybody has an opinion on how to set those tensioners right. I found actually 3 different times where I had motor failure, and I believe it's directly related to the manual tensioner. Let me try to explain. First of all, the failure on these 3 motors, and they were all new. Well, 2 were new, the 3rd was not. They were all the same failure point, and it was shearing the cam bolts for the cam sprocket off the exhaust side of the engine. Okay, not necessarily at full RPM, you know, in kind of various different moments, but that was the failure that happened each and every time. And here's the belief. Excuse me, I got this sinus thing going on. So here's the belief. The tension on that chain, as I said, is extremely important. Overtension could be a problem. The manual tensioners themselves actually are fixed and rigid, of course, as you know, right? Whereas the OEM or the stock tensioners actually are spring or hydraulic based, they actually have a little bit of compliance. My belief is what's been happening is, if you think about it, when the bike engine is upshifting or downshifting, you know, think about it from a you know, in the motorcycle bike itself, right? When a driver is downshifting hard and braking and going through the gears quickly, both up and downshift, there's especially on the downshifting side, but there's an energy from the contact patch of the tire all the way up in through the engine into the valve train and such when this happens. And a motorcycle has a very narrow, 2-inch maybe wide contact patch of the tire on the road surface. Whereas a race car, like mine as an example, I run 10-inch wide slicks on the rear of the car. So that's 20 inches of rubber contact patch on the rear of the car. And my belief is that the amount of energy being transmitted through the downshifts and upshifts through the race car, through the gearbox, you know, in through the engine and the valve train, has contributed to the cause of some of those failures using a manual chain tensioner. That chain apparatus around the valve train did not have any, let's say, compliance at all that would allow the somewhat of a filtering or dampening of the energy through that system during up and down shifts. When I use the OEM tensioners, I have 0 issues. It could have been simply too much tension on the manual tensioners. Could have been too little. Doesn't really matter. I just wanted to pass this along. It's something I would recommend that you stick with the OEM tensioners for race car use for your motorcycle engine. Again, it's just my tip, all right? So I hope you enjoyed this video. You know, I just wanted to show the steps that are involved in getting a ZX10R motor ready to install in your race car, and specifically adapting it from a bike application for a race car itself. So I hope this was useful. I hope you enjoyed the video, and stay tuned. I'll have another video shortly where I'll take you through the steps as I install this motor in the race car again. So you'll see that happen. You'll see the motor come alive and so on, okay? So that's it. I appreciate you watching, and any comments are welcome, of course, ideas and such. And until next time, all right? Ciao. Bye.